Morning. Is it good to be back in church? How many were here last week? Many of you, right? Amen. Would you enjoy Mike's preaching last week? You blessed by it? Yes. All right. Well, hope it lasts. Please open your Bibles to James 1, verse 12, and we're going to read verses 12 through 18 together. Our goal is to take this even slower than Colossians. We'll see. Get all the way to 2024. What do you think, Mike? We could do it, right? We could do it. Begin reading with me in verse 12. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Amen? Amen. Today we are fortunate to have a large building to meet in, to be able to gather in large numbers. I know that that's been off and on for a little while now. But today, a lot of people. Church is back. Amen? Amen. Now, most of the world that has lots of Christians has large churches with facilities, and many people have the access to the internet they need to watch online sermons and stuff like that. You guys ever do that? Some people are doing it right now, watching online sermons. If you want to talk to someone else who's a believer, what do? Can you pick up a phone? You can text them. In many ways, we are blessed as believers today. Not everywhere and every place and not all the time, but in many senses, church is easier today than it was way back in the first century. Did you guys know that? James is writing to groups of Christians who are separated from each other. They're in smaller groups. They're not as outwardly focused, meaning many times they have to meet in houses or small places so as not to be persecuted. They're minorities in the cities that they live in. They're usually not tons and tons of Christians in particular cities. They can't communicate easily to each other. So you have to send a letter by person to someone else. James has to write a letter. He can't call them or stream in. It's a different situation. James is writing to churches who are not ones that possess a great deal of power. Not that every church today does. They're not churches typically that possess a great deal of wealth. They don't possess a great deal of social cash. So he's writing to groups of people who are, in many ways, the underdog of the social religious arena. Now, what happened? How many Christians are there today? Who are like, well, 2 billion people call themselves Christians. Maybe not 2 billion, but it seems like God has been faithful, amen? But the advice that James gives to the churches then, I think, is applicable to us, because it is not always the case that our lives go the way that we want. Is that right? Everyone here, everything going the right way for you right now? Anyone here experiencing a trial? Just a few of you. How about, is there anyone here that has ever experienced a trial? We have a few of you. Good. James's words will help then, I believe. Last week, Mike preached on God redeeming trials, and we're going to continue to talk about that a little bit. But before we do, I kind of want to do a little bit of theological background to help us appreciate and understand James better. I want to dive into the relationship real quickly between faith and works. James has a famous passage about faith and works later that I'm hoping Mike will get so he can expertly work through that. But I want to talk just a little bit about it now, because James has hard words for us, he has hard words for you and for me. And to understand his words more fully, I think we need to understand clearly the relationship between faith and works. So really, this is just kind of a description of the gospel. You all believe the gospel, amen? We're saved by what? By faith, through the grace of God. Do we earn our own salvation? Okay, so that means that the merit, the righteousness, the hard work, the achievement of salvation for all who believe is based not in anything that we do or say or refrain from, but in the powerful work of Jesus at the cross. You were saved not because you did anything good, although you might do some good things. You were saved because God was good. Human beings were sinful. They had turned against God. They had rebelled against God. And the wrath of God was meant to be poured out on sinners. Every single person here today was born that way. You were born an enemy of God. Some of you today, right now, may still be enemies of God. And the wrath of God is poured out on his enemies because God is holy and is righteous and he does not tolerate sin or evil or wickedness. So God takes on human flesh. He lives a perfect life. He dies a humiliating death, and then the wrath of the Father is poured out on the Son so that all who call on the name of the Son might attain righteousness only in his name, and he might die for their sin. Everyone still following me? This is why Paul says that God acted this way so that he could be both just, he deals with sin, and the justifier of the one who believes. So just to be clear, we are saved because God is good, not because we are good. Salvation is not something we achieve, it's something that we receive. Now, I think there's two main ways that we misunderstand this, and it's dangerous. One is a sort of libertine gospel. You may have encountered people like this, people who are like, Jesus paid the price, so I'm going to run the tab up. I will do what I want when I want because Jesus saved me. It's a libertine understanding of the gospel. It is actually not the true gospel. It's one that gives license to sin. The gospel doesn't give license to sin. My guess is most people here, however, are not struggling with a libertine view of the gospel. The other one would be a legalist version of the gospel. Most of you have encountered this. Many of us have engaged in this. It's this like view that Jesus did most of the work. You know what I'm talking about? He got me almost there, but I got to be like a little bit good to get to the end. Anyone know what I'm talking about? I have 1,000 salvation points through Jesus, but to get into eternity, I need like 1,050. And I don't want to lose any by sinning, and I want to gain a few by doing good works. You guys know what I'm talking about? I think most of us wouldn't say that we do this, but I do think, and I know in my own heart, that thought can creep in, and I can kind of quietly and sometimes unknowingly come to believe that my good works contribute to my salvation. They don't. All right, now, are you still with me? Okay. Do good works still matter in light of what I just said? Good, I'm so glad we've gotten this far. Saturday, I would ask questions, and they're like, you are the one who's supposed to just tell us. Works matter, not because they save us, but because they show us that we are saved. Obedience is the standard that's given in the Scripture. If you are worried about your position before God, the question you should ask is not, have I been obedient enough to be granted God's favor? The question is, does my quality of life match the thing I say about myself? God is the only one that can grant a new heart. Is that right? And we believe that the gospel of salvation is a miracle. You are granted a new heart. You are taken from death to life. It's something that's done to you. It's not something you achieve. But a new heart, a true new heart, will, without exception, necessarily lead to a new life. Now, are you still with me? Okay. James is describing to us in this letter how we as lovers of Jesus, as people with new hearts, as members of this embassy of heaven on earth, he is describing to us how to faithfully live out that new life. He gives us advice, he gives us strategies, he gives us wisdom so that we might faithfully live out that new life. I want to just reread some of the verses that Pastor Mike worked through last week in James 1, 2 through 4. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces what? Steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. James is drawing a connection between the Christian life and trials that we experience. And as we move into the section that we have this morning, James is including in that discussion the subject of temptation. We read verse 12 real quickly. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Do you want to remain steadfast to the end, church? Do you want to live out faithful and obedient lives for a God that you love? Do you want to be greeted at the end by your Savior? I feel like it should be a more assertive yes than that. I was like, do you all want $10? Yeah. Do you want to remain steadfast to the end and be greeted with the words, well done, my good and faithful servant? Yes. James is going to help us understand how to more faithfully live a life that leads to that. We don't earn it, we receive it, but we do live it out. I want to just talk about two things, just from this first verse real quickly, that as I read this passage, help me to understand it and appreciate it more. One is the path of obedience and steadfastness that leads to the end is not a short path, it's a long path. It has increased, or it continues day by day. Obeying Jesus today does not guarantee my obedience tomorrow. We all know this, right? Obeying Jesus tomorrow does not guarantee my obedience on Tuesday. It is a long path of endurance. Secondly, church, it is worth it. It's worth it. It's worth it. I want to read you just a verse from Revelation. Jesus at the end talking to his people. He says, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. We have a hopeful end. I think in these past few years, one of the things that has comforted me the most when I've been confused or anxious or frustrated is that the end is already written. We know what happens. God achieves victory and he takes his bride. That's how it ends. I know when I was younger, I like to call myself a young man. Can I still? A young man, like 35, halfway done. A young man, on my way there. When I was even younger, I knew that things would happen in my future that would bring me joy in the future. I would look forward to finishing college. I would look forward to getting married. I would look forward to having kids and having a home together. I would look forward to maybe career success or things I would do. Anyone ever look forward to something in the future that they are excited about? Yeah. Okay. The more complex my life has become, the more responsibility that I've taken on, the more risks that I've incurred, the more nuanced my life is, the higher highs that I experience and the lower lows that I experience have made me come to realize that the only true anchor of hope I have is the perfect future that a faithful God is going to bring about. And so I just want to encourage you, I believe it's okay to love these other things in life. None of them will carry you to the end. Only Jesus will. So James gives us a handful of, I think, words of wisdom to help us live obedient lives, to help us avoid temptation. Because there's a connection between trial and temptation. Temptation, I believe, is most often acutely or intensely experienced when we are experiencing trials. I'm not saying that temptation isn't always at the door. It can be. I'm saying when we're under pressure in one way or another, that is when we're most intensely persecuted. I believe that's why James brings it up here. I think we're most tempted to engage in some sort of financial impropriety when we are struggling financially. I think we are most tempted to treat other people badly when we feel mistreated. I think we are most tempted to engage in licentious activity, in sexual immorality, when we feel lonely. Are you with me when I say all those things? Yeah? So James is going to give us some strategies. I want to begin with the simple word of taking temptation seriously. Taking temptation seriously. Read verses 13 through 15 with me. James says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. James is talking here about blame shifting. I am a master at blame shifting. I just want to be honest with you guys. How many of you guys have become adept, good at shifting blame? Anybody willing to admit that? Anybody out there see blame and you're like, I'll take that. I'll take the blame. Just walking around, take blame for things. You're like, anybody out there commit wrongs that you'd like me to take the blame for? I love taking blame. We've been doing it for a while. We're so good at it because it's one of the first things we did. You guys know how the narrative of the Bible opens. God creates the world. He creates Adam and Eve in his own image. He sends them into the garden and says, there's just a few things I don't want you to do. The set of rules is very small. And then what do Adam and Eve do? Yeah, they don't obey God. It's kind of why we're at where we are now. So God, knowing what they've done, goes to the garden. He knows what Adam has done. He says to Adam, did you do the one thing I told you not to do? Here's Adam's response. The woman. Let me just pause there for a moment. Some marriage counseling. I would suggest, men, you don't throw your wives under the bus immediately when something in your life is not going well. So Adam starts off strongly here. He blames the woman with his first words, too. No softening there. And then he continues, because that wasn't enough. He goes, whom you gave to be with me. So it's like, the woman did it. Also, just a reminder, God, you put her in my life. It's sad that the story of human history begins with someone shifting blame, first to someone else and then to God himself. I know we see this, and we think, man, Adam's a coward. He's a dummy. And I know that I am as guilty of Adam, as blatantly and as nakedly here, of shifting blame. I would doubt that there's anyone here that hasn't done that. It's a thing that we do. It's our natural impulse. And I do think it most often begins by shifting blame to other people. And want to be clear, I do this. I trust that God will strengthen and grow me over time, but I do this. And then from other people, we shift it to circumstances. We think about what's going on in our life, and we shift the blame of committing sin to our circumstances. We say, God, you are the one who led me into this new situation where now I'm not making enough money to provide for my family. So I'm going to start being greedy and hoarding my money. God, you made me do it. We eventually begin to shift our blame to God. We do believe in the sovereignty of God. Wherever you're at right now, God has you there. I believe he's there with you, as we'll see in a moment, but God has you there. We go from people to circumstances to God himself. So we actually end up making this mistake where we point our finger at the only actual holy being in the universe, the only completely holy person in whom there is no unrighteousness. The way the Bible talks about God is holy, holy, holy. So far above us in terms of righteousness, it's hard for our brains to comprehend. And we do this thing where we're like, well, it's obviously God's fault. James says, God is not subject to being tempted by evil. There's no chink in his armor. One pastor says there is no itch that the devil could scratch on God. He's not susceptible to sin. He also does not tempt his people. He's unable to do so. Now, one of the difficulties we have in this passage is the word for test and tempt in Greek is the same word. I would very comfortably say God tests us. Do you believe that God tests us? He tests us, I think, to humble us. I think he tests us to shape us, to strengthen us. Sometimes I think he tests us to vindicate us or to prove us. We see that happening with prophets and kings all throughout the Old Testament. But God does not test us so that we might sin. His motivation is never to lead us into sin. James is saying that here. God's desire is not that you would sin. He is not taking you by the hand and walking you into the valley of death so that you might sin against him. James also doesn't mention the devil here. He doesn't mention Satan. Now, I want to be clear, Satan exists. I'm not one of those guys that weirdly thinks Satan doesn't exist. He does. But he's not mentioned here. He's called the father of lies other places. You would think that James would be like, God doesn't tempt you. Satan does. They say the devil made me do it, right? James tells us where sin comes from. This is a hard word for us. I know that technically we believe this, but it's a hard word. Here's what he says. Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by what? His own desire. There's a Baptist preacher named Adrian Rogers. I don't know enough about him to like recommend him wholeheartedly or to warn you about him, just to be clear. He may be great, he may be not so great, but he does have one line that I like. He says, sin is an inside job. That our tendency is to look at the people around us, at the circumstances around us, at God himself, at the various things that have happened to us, and we blame our sin on those things. I think that circumstances can contribute to our likelihood to commit sin. I think if someone is in a place in their life where they're likely to be committing sin because they're constantly being tempted, and we have the ability to pull them out of that situation, we should. However, that doesn't mean that when one commits sin, they can blame it on their circumstances. I like to think of this story of this, I think he's like a teenager, and he ate tons and tons of McDonald's. Do you guys like McDonald's? You guys like McDonald's. I don't. So. Someone ate tons and tons of McDonald's. Their body began to fall apart, and they're like, who did this to me? And they sue McDonald's. I think there's a sense in which our culture tries to teach us to blame sin on other people, that our hearts desire to blame sin on other people. I think James is saying, cut it out with all of that. Cut it out. Sin begins on the inside of your heart, not on the outside. I think the second thing that James wants us to do in order to take temptation seriously is to know its danger. Sin is dangerous, and by extension, temptation can be dangerous. We used to live in an apartment that had lots of mice. You guys ever live in a house or somewhere that has mice? Anybody? And so my wife became like a master mouse murderer, like really good at killing mice. You get a mouse trap out, right? And you put peanut butter on the mouse trap. If you don't know, that's what you do. Get a plastic trap, not a wood one. You can reset it. And you just place it out where the mouse is going to walk along. And then how's it end? Yeah, with a dead mouse. And I just, like, what I'm trying to point out here is the mouse doesn't walk into the room and see the whole trap in peanut butter and go, I'm willing to exchange my life for that peanut butter. He can only see the thing he wants and doesn't know it will lead him to his death. So James gives us this progression. He gives us this progression in verse 15, he says, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to what? And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. I think it is our tendency to, over time, to become flippant about both sinful activities in our life or the presence of temptations in our life or the state of morality in the world we live in. Like greed and violence and sexuality are so flippantly displayed in our culture everywhere that maybe there's a sense in which our hearts have kind of grown cold to how dangerous those things actually are. And I think also, I don't want to do the exclusively culture blaming. I think we've invited it into our homes, in television and in movies and in books and in the way we conduct ourselves. Because it seems like no big deal, but really it is. It's dangerous. I think James has hard words. He is warning us. It is dangerous. It's dangerous. you ever been on a small, thin road for the first time? Anybody? You're driving, and the first time you encounter the danger of the road, if you're like me, you turn the radio down for some reason, and you lean in, and if you are really stressed out, your whole back starts to hurt, and you're gripping the steering wheel like it's a seatbelt, but it's not. And you're afraid because the road is dangerous, right? You're at least very cautious. And then you see someone drive by who's been on that road thousands of times, and they zip down the road like there is no danger. Anybody ever experienced anything like that? The road is just as dangerous for them as it is for you. They're just used to it. Do you see what I'm saying? My concern is that James, if he were to see the state of some of our lives today, not all of our lives, but some of our lives, he would see people walking around buildings that are burning down. He'd be screaming, "Get out of there, it's dangerous." We'd be like, "I'm used to this now." We should take temptation seriously. We should take sin seriously. We should see the progression from being enticed by misordered desires all the way to our own death. James is saying, take it seriously. I think, secondly, he wants us to trust God completely. Let's read verses 16 and 17. "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." One of the things that I love about James and about the New Testament in general is it does not spend a lot of time, some, but not a lot of time, convincing us that God exists and that God is good. It just says God exists and God is good. Have you ever in your life, either yourself or encountered someone who struggles with whether or not God is actually good? Anybody? Just a few of us. There's all kinds of philosophical arguments you can engage in. You can read, I think, really excellent books on the existence of God and the goodness of God. There are Christian philosophers doing good work. They've been doing good work for thousands of years. There's a place for that. Most people you meet and most people here today would be far better served by simply saying, "I'm just going to believe the assertion that God is good. I'm just going to choose to believe that. I'm not going to do all this math where I calculate all the evil in the world and all the good in the world and cause and effect and then decide at the very end, if I carry all the ones correctly, that yes, God is good or not good." It's the way of madness. Just simply believe that God is good and continue to believe that when life is not good. And you will experience a type of freedom and peace and calm that you never have before. Just simply to believe that. Do I think that you can make arguments philosophically for the goodness of God? Yes. I know very few people who have come to believe that God is good because of a really dense philosophy book. I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure they're out there. God uses everything. But simply to believe He is good will give you freedom that you have not had before, if that's something that you've been struggling with. He says, every good gift and every perfect gift is given from God. I think believing that God is good, just really leaning into that belief, does two things. One, it helps us to cherish gifts more fully. We see the things we have as given to us by God, and we love them in the proper order because God has given them to us. When I was young, 9 years old, 8 years old, something like that, my dad, who's from Arkansas, would do this very Arkansas, king of the hill sort of thing. He'd walk out and he'd stare at the lawn. He'd have his coffee and he'd just stare at the lawn. Now I'm 8 and I'm like, well, Dad, there's G.I. Joe on inside, Saturday morning cartoons. What are you doing? And he would say, God gives and God takes away, and He's given me this, and I'm going to enjoy this gift. You think, okay. The point is, because he saw the thing as having come from God, he had the proper appreciation for it, and he was actually able to enjoy it even more. You guys follow me that? Okay. So just a very specific application of that. Husbands, love your wives. Cherish them. Remember that God gave them to you, even though you did not deserve them. And the more you do that, the more you cherish and the more you love and the more you treasure your wife because God gave her to you, the less enticing the temptations of the world will seem. Love your wives. I think the other thing that really truly believing God is good does is it enables us to reframe our hardship. That when we are in the midst of trial and tempted to sin because we're unhappy with where we are at, believing that God is truly good reframes our hardship. Our God is a God, the God of redemption. He takes sad things and brings about joy. He takes broken things and brings about wholeness. He takes evil things and brings about goodness. He takes death and brings about life. You guys remember the story of Joseph in the Old Testament? Joseph has a bunch of brothers, and they're all not fans of Joseph, so they sell him into slavery, which seems like an overreaction. And he's in slavery, and he ends up in prison, and things aren't going well, and eventually things turn his way. God raises Joseph back up, and he becomes a leader in Egypt, and there's a famine, and then his brothers go to Egypt to get food, and the brother that they sold into slavery is now one of the most important, powerful figures in Egypt. Hard moment for the brothers. And Joseph, upon hearing their apology, says, what you meant for evil, God meant for what? Good. God took a public execution and paved the way of salvation for all human beings that call on the name of Jesus. He is capable. He is capable of displaying his strength through your weakness. He is capable of displaying his righteousness through your obedience. He is capable of taking a situation right now for you that is hard, that is complex, that maybe you don't see a way out of, that feels very lonely or dark or despairing. He is able to take those things and bring about great good. There are many of you here today who have already experienced this in your life. So in that moment, those of you who are here this morning that are in despair, trust and believe that God is good. And I believe you will experience a sort of freedom and peace that you have never experienced before. Lean into that belief. Lean into the belief that God is good. And you will be able to trust him even more fully. Amen? James then begins to talk about God using the phrase Father of lights. Can you throw that verse up for me, Christian? Yeah. Coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. James is probably in calling God the Father of lights, referring to God as the creator of the lights. Let's just go to that passage real quick. In Genesis 1, and God said, let there be what? Plural, not light, lights. In the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on them, or on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was what? Good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. So God created the whole world. Is that right? He created the entire universe. He spoke it into existence. Some of you guys have seen like those YouTube videos where they start with like one size of a star, and like, but check out this star, it's a little bit bigger. You know what I'm talking about? And then they show you like the next biggest star, and then they show you like nebulas and galaxies, and you see the absolute immense scale of the universe, and your brain is like, no, stop, it's too much. You know what I'm talking about? Like, I feel like I watch those, and I'm just going to pass out. Like, here's this star, which is 1,000 billion times bigger than the star that seems enormous here. And you're like, my brain can't I can't even get around the vastness of the universe. And we worship the God who literally told it to exist. He just said, be, and they were. James is communicating to us by calling the God we worship the Father of lights, that the God we worship is a profoundly powerful God. So powerful that it's hard for our brains to really get around how powerful he is. But also, throughout the entire Bible, we learn that this Lord who can speak things into existence is a personal God. That he knows where every star in the universe is, and he knows your name and what's in your heart and what you are dealing with right now. He knows your future. He is as concerned with you as he is with anyone else. This is this really powerful truth that's true about Christianity. I'm not sure if it's true about other religions. I'm not sure. I don't think so. That we believe in an all-powerful God that cares about you individually. He actually knows you. David says, the Lord, and he means Yahweh, the creator of heaven and earth, is my shepherd, the guy who is with me, who is beside me. We believe that God has led you into whatever situation you are in. We also believe he is with you in whatever situation you are in. One, we can just believe that God is powerful and personal, and we can believe that he is reliable. That's the other thing James is communicating here, that God is reliable. Anybody have someone in their life that is incredibly reliable? Just me? A few of you. Maybe we should raise the reliability quotient here. Yeah, be reliable. That's good. God is reliable. In the past, the stars were used for all kinds of things. Some people use the stars to try and predict the future. You can't do that. Most of us here today don't believe the stars can predict the future. If you do believe that, please set up a meeting with Mike Nazarian. He'd be happy to meet with you and talk with you the whole thing. But they also use the stars to do what? To navigate. We don't do that today, right? You're not driving at night and lean up to look for the stars. Use your phone. But for years and years and years and years, people all over the world in different cultures use the stars to navigate. And what is the star, the one? We all know that. I've never once used the North Star to get anywhere ever. But I know that the North Star was basically humankind's GPS for all of human history. And in a few thousand years, it won't be where it's supposed to be anymore. It won't be a reliable navigative force. It's going to move. Or the Earth moves, I don't really know. But basically the idea is we won't be able to use the North Star to navigate anymore. You guys still following me? Yeah. The stars were seen as incredibly reliable. Seasons change, tides change, weather changes, people change, societies changed. But there was a great value placed on the stars in the heavens because according to ancients, you look at the stars, they always kind of did the same thing. They would travel the same paths, and they'd look at the North Star and that guy doesn't even move. But it's going to move. It's no longer going to be a reliable source of navigation for human beings. Part of what James is saying here is something like everything else will eventually fail you. In a few hundred years, we don't know what society will look like. Tomorrow, you don't know what you may or may not be diagnosed with. You don't know what relationships you're going to have a month from now. You don't know if you're going to have your job. You don't know any of those things. And even really reliable things, the North Star is going to let you down eventually. In 100 million billion years, God will never change. That is a profoundly comforting truth. He's not going to change. No matter how much time passes for all of eternity, he will not change. He will not forget you. He will not grow cold to you. He will not drift away from you. He will not break his promises. How many of you have had a promise broken that needed to be kept by someone in your life? God will not break his promises. Now, I just want to pause for a second and tell you the sorts of promises God makes to you. God promises to not leave you or forsake you. God promises to admit you into his kingdom if you called on the name of his Son. He promises to have washed away all of your sins. But he does not promise that every detail of your life, or for some of us, that most of the details of your life will go the way that you want. I believe when you are in a trial, it's okay to pray for deliverance, to pray boldly, to pray courageously. God, deliver me from this illness or this situation. But as Mike pointed out last week, very importantly, James tells them when they are suffering, when they are in trials, to pray for wisdom. Wisdom, to be strengthened through that suffering. It is a way that we can trust God completely. The world around us is going to change. It has changed. Is that right? It's going to change. God won't. Trust him instead. So when we are tempted to sin, when things are uncertain around us for one way or another, the way out provided by us is to simply trust God. Lastly, I believe James desires for his readers and for us to treasure God's victory. To treasure God's victory. Read verse 18 with me. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. There's a lot in this verse. He's here talking about the fact that the church is an embassy from heaven. It's both from the future and from heaven. It is God's beginning movement on the earth. When we're gathered together as a group of believers and we hear the gospel preached, we take the ordinances, we take communion, baptism and communion happen in our midst, we are experiencing a foretaste of what heaven will be. It's here on earth now. Now, some of you guys are thinking that you don't always like being in church. I understand. I'm saying we have the privileged place of showing the world around us and each other what it looks like to be a redeemed people. James is saying that here. He's also saying, this is important, pop up verse 18 for me again. He begins by saying, in verse 18, of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth. God chose to make us who we are. It was his will, not our will, that has gathered us today as a body of believers. That's really important. God chose you to be here. Like, not just generally chose you to be here, but this morning also. He chose that you would be here right now. What James is doing is he's reminding us of for sure, the most important reason we have for believing that God is good, what he has already achieved through the cross. He's saying God made a people for himself through his Son. In the Old Testament, one of the most common refrains when prophets are seeking to encourage or rebuke the people of God, the Israelites, as they are in the midst of trials or sometimes as they are in the midst of sin, is to remind them what it is that God has already done for them. The prophets say things like, the Lord, says, and this Lord that we're talking about is the one who brought you up out from under the Egyptians into the promised land, that stretches hand out in mighty powers and sent plagues and parted an ocean and was present with you in a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. The prophets are like, look at what he's already done. You can trust him to do the things he says he's going to do. So I just want to end by reminding us what it is that he's already done. I'm going to read a verse that I've read before. I think Mike's read it before. Zach's read it before. We've read it a million times. It's a significant passage. I don't get tired of reading it. I feel like I could just read it 5 more times before we close, and that'd be better than anything else I have to say. In Ephesians 2, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now is at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. Just want to pause for a second. Paul is saying in this passage, and I believe James would agree with what Paul has to say here, he is saying everyone who's hearing this was at one time dead, completely unable to do anything on their own accord. You take sick people to hospitals, you take corpses to morgues. You know that a corpse does not get better. So what Paul is about to describe is not just a feat of strength, it is an absolute miracle. It says this, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that the coming ages he might show, he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in the coming ages, he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in who? Show me the famous one. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of work, so that no one may boast. Here's the last part. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Paul is saying, and I believe along with James, that God has preordained for you the righteousness that you will walk in now because he has brought you from death to life. I believe, I want you to believe, that the very same power that saved you from your sin will see you through your sorrows. The very same power that raised you from the dead will enable you and strengthen you to walk in your new life. The very same power that raised Jesus from the dead can strengthen you in temptation and protect you along the way, so that in the end you will receive the crown of life. Amen? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the blessing it is to meet together. We thank you how you have protected us and preserved us over these many, many uncertain and difficult months. We thank you that you have granted so many in our congregation humble and patient hearts. We thank you that you have protected us financially, that you have protected us medically, and that you've protected us spiritually. We would like to pour out our heart in gratefulness for the many ways that you have preserved us. And we trust that you will continue to do so. Pray for our church right now, that you continue to conform us into the likeness of your Son, that as we leave the walls today, as we go out, we remember that in many ways we are functioning as ambassadors of Jesus Christ, that we are citizens of heaven, that we live in earth, but we have this irrevocable call to tell people about you. Give me personally this week courage to talk to people about Jesus, and I pray you do the same for others who are here. We thank you. We thank you for the blessing it is to meet together.